Rome, 45 AD. The forum is buzzing with voices, merchants haggling over spices, magistrates issuing decrees, patricians whispering about Senate intrigue. But at one marble villa, all is quiet. A senator's wife is setting the table for dinner. Her children are with their tutors. Her household follows the daily rhythm of Roman aristocracy. Then there's a knock, not a casual one, heavy, deliberate, 3 times. Outside stand imperial guards, stoic, adorned in crimson and gold. Their presence means one of 2 things, honor or doom. The woman opens the door. They speak her name, not her husband's, not her father's, hers. She is being summoned by order of the Empress Valeria Messalina, not for a crime, not for questioning, but for service. What follows is not a tale of scandal. It is a tale of a system, systematic humiliation engineered not in back alleys or secret chambers, but from the heart of imperial power. A system so calculated, so ingrained in Rome's machinery, that it operated in daylight, with scrolls and schedules and stamped permissions. For 7 years, the palace of the Roman Empire, the very embodiment of civilization, housed a forced prostitution ring. But this wasn't aimed at the poor, the enslaved, or the foreigners. It targeted Rome's own daughters, senators' wives, consuls' nieces, the nobility, and at its center was Messalina. History often paints her as a femme fatale, beautiful, ambitious, reckless. But this image is a lie of omission. What Messalina built was not just a playground of lust, it was a regime of fear cloaked in the language of loyalty, a machine that could destroy a family's future with a single invitation to the palace. This story is not just about sex or scandal, it's about power, about how shame becomes a weapon, how silence is enforced not by chains, but by honor and fear, about how an empire known for law and order could host one of the most efficient systems of dehumanization ever devised, and call it patriotism. She didn't need soldiers to enforce it. She had etiquette, tradition, and the knowledge that every Roman mother wanted her children to rise, and feared what would happen if they fell. Rome had seen blood before, gladiator games, assassinations, coups, but this was something else. It was quiet, polite, perfectly legal. It is easy to imagine Rome as a civilization of glory, triumphs, architecture, philosophy. But behind every golden dome, there are shadows, and one of the darkest belongs to a woman whose name still echoes like a warning through history. Messalina. And now we open the doors to her empire, not the one ruled by Claudius, but the one she built beneath his nose. Let's step inside. The palace brothel system. Imagine this. You're the wife of a respected Roman senator. You come from a lineage that traces back generations. Your family crest is carved into temple walls. Your father served in the consul. Your children are being groomed for magistracies. You are Rome's ideal of dignity. Then a scroll arrives, an official summons bearing the imperial seal. It's not a request, it's an honor. You've been chosen to serve the empress, but behind the gilded words is a sentence. Because what awaits you inside the Palatine Palace is not a feast or ceremony. It is a chamber stripped of names, identities, and autonomy. You are now, by decree, an imperial asset. Messalina's system was meticulous. This wasn't some feverish indulgence of a mad empress. It was a bureaucratic masterpiece, clinical, efficient, deeply Roman in its organization. There were ledgers, medical exams, appearance evaluations, psychographic profiling. Officials tracked everything from family political allegiance to your likely emotional compliance. They had files on everyone. Every woman selected was analyzed for utility, who her husband was, what position he sought, what debts he owed. Some were chosen because they were beautiful. others because their families needed a nudge or a threat. Some were simply in the wrong faction at the wrong time. Messalina's agents arrived not as brutes, but as civil servants. They carried recruitment lists. These weren't hidden documents. They were formal and stamped, complete with quotas. They described women in clinical detail: hair color, height, disposition, marital connections. Not unlike how merchants would rate wine or olive oil. And once your name was on that list, there was no safe refusal. The language used was always the same. Your family's loyalty is being tested. Your husband's political future depends on your cooperation. The empire thanks you for your service. And then, the stripping begins. Not just of clothing, but of personhood. You are given new garments, told not to speak of your past, forbidden from using your name. You become a role, a title, a number, a luxury product, marketed and sold to Rome's most powerful men. Because these clients weren't strangers off the street. They were governors, senators, foreign ambassadors, men who paid exorbitantly not in spite of your nobility, but because of it. There was a twisted prestige in bedding a woman of your rank, especially when it came with imperial blessing. Some men used this access to negotiate treaties, others to secure military contracts. Many simply saw it as the ultimate Roman indulgence, power made flesh. And Messalina, she profited at every level. Records show the palace generated revenue from these sessions. Fees were collected, preferences noted, appointments booked, repeat clients given privileges. It was an empire within the empire, hidden in plain sight. But what haunts historians isn't just the system's size, it's its normalcy. This wasn't a secret shame. It was considered a civic duty. Refusal wasn't just social suicide, it was political treason. A woman who refused could doom her husband's future, her children's marriage prospects, her family's standing. And if she broke under the weight of it all, well, Rome had little pity for the dishonored. Some women never returned. Others took their own lives. A few, tragically, came to believe this was simply their role. A Roman matron, after all, existed for the glory of her family and her empire, even if it meant sacrificing her soul. And through it all, Messalina stood at the center, watching, cataloging, smiling. She didn't need to raise a sword. Her power came from ink, wax seals, and whispered threats. From knowing that even the most virtuous woman could be broken, not by force, but by expectation. Rome had given her the perfect tools: hierarchy, ambition, and silence. And she used them all. Spectacle as power. If the brothel system had remained a hidden engine, cold, efficient, and silent, it would still be monstrous. But Messalina didn't stop at utility. She turned it into theater. The palace halls, already the stage for political intrigue and imperial decrees, became arenas of humiliation. The performances were not plays or poetry recitals. They were contests of degradation, where nobility was stripped from women, not just privately, but publicly. The most infamous of these spectacles began with a challenge. Messalina, Empress of Rome, issued it herself. Her opponent? A professional courtesan named Sylla, famed across Rome for her beauty and stamina. The contest? To see who could sleep with more men in a single day. 24 hours. No breaks. No disguises. No shame. It wasn't a secret affair behind closed doors. Messalina invited witnesses. The palace was fitted with special chambers for observation, raised platforms, shaded balconies. Rome's elites watched, laughed, placed bets. The line between politics and perversion dissolved entirely. And when the sun set, the victor was clear. Messalina. 25 encounters. Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, no strangers to Rome's depravity, recorded the event with disbelief. Even they, chroniclers of an age where slavery and vice were commonplace, wrote of Messalina's contests as excesses beyond measure. But this wasn't merely for pleasure. It was a lesson. A signal to the women of Rome: you are replaceable. Your lineage will not save you. Your shame is entertainment. Your silence is your survival. Messalina blurred every line, between public and private, duty and debasement, honor and humiliation. Noblewomen were made to compete alongside trained prostitutes in these grotesque endurance contests. Losing meant disgrace, winning meant being asked back. And all of it, every gasp, every sob, every bowed head, was documented, tied to names, families, factions. The humiliation became leverage. The performance became currency. It didn't matter whether you volunteered or resisted. Once you stepped into the chamber, you were changed, and the world would know. Even Rome's foreign guests weren't spared this imperial entertainment. Visiting kings and governors were offered gifts upon arrival. Access to Roman noblewomen, presented not as victims but as tributes. It was a statement. Rome is so powerful, even our finest women serve your pleasure. A display of dominance dressed in silk. But behind every staged smile, there were lives unraveling. Women returned to their homes unable to meet their husbands' eyes. Children grew up hearing whispers. That's the daughter of one of Messalina's favorites. Reputations collapsed. Entire family trees withered in political exile and social shame. And the Empress? She sat above it all, watching with satisfaction. The more the system spread, the more irreplaceable she became. To question her was to question the very mechanisms of Rome. She wasn't just exploiting her position, she was her position, and that made her untouchable, or so she believed. Because while Messalina reveled in turning pain into pageantry, she was building something far more dangerous than a pleasure palace. She was building a network. And in the next part of our story, that network begins to claim lives. Blackmail, blood, and shadow rule. By now, the palace was more than just a seat of power. It was a trap, a spider's web spun with silk and threat, where every strand was a secret, and every secret could strangle a man's future or end his life entirely. Messalina wasn't content with controlling bodies. She wanted to control fates. And she knew that the most powerful currency in Rome wasn't gold. It was leverage. Every name on her scrolls, every encounter logged and archived. These became tools, bargaining chips. And in the hands of someone like Messalina, tools become weapons. It began with whispers. A senator whose wife had served unusually long at the palace now received a coveted military command. A magistrate's vote shifted unexpectedly in the Senate. A governor who once opposed Messalina's allies now praised her in public. One by one, men found their resistance dulled by the quiet threat of exposure. Because she kept everything. There were no rumors here. These were documents, client schedules, preference logs, payouts, even love letters between clients and women too terrified to refuse affection. Messalina had turned imperial hospitality into an intelligence apparatus. But when persuasion failed, she reached for the knife. Take Decimus Valerius Asiaticus. Wealthy, influential. He owned the gardens of Lucullus, lush, vast, and desirable. Messalina wanted them. She accused him of plotting treason. The trial was held not in a court, but in the emperor's private chambers. Claudius presided, confused, half convinced. Messalina stood nearby, watching. Asiaticus defended himself well. The evidence was flimsy, but just as acquittal neared, a witness suddenly appeared. The verdict turned. Asiaticus was sentenced to death. Shortly after, Messalina acquired the gardens, property sealed by blood. And then there was Lucius Silanus, a nobleman once engaged to Messalina's own daughter. When he resisted her advances, she accused him of incest. No trial this time, just a quiet command. Silanus was forced to commit suicide. But her most cunning kill was within the family. Her own stepfather, Appius Silanus, had married her mother. He was popular, steady, a quiet threat. Messalina approached him, privately, and made her intent clear. She wanted him, not politically, personally. When he rejected her, on account of being her stepfather, she reacted with terrifying precision. The next morning, Claudius was told that both Messalina and his chief secretary Narcissus had suffered the same dream. Silanus was plotting to murder him. A divine warning, an omen. Claudius, deeply superstitious, was shaken. When Silanus entered the palace for his morning duty, Claudius panicked. He saw the dream coming true before his eyes. He gave the order. Silanus was executed on the spot. Messalina had killed a man, using only a dream. This was her genius. Not just murder, psychological assassination. And each death served a purpose: consolidating wealth, removing rivals, enforcing silence. Because Rome was watching. And the message was clear. Resist, and we erase you. Obey, and we reward you, if only temporarily. The real brilliance lay in how plausible it all seemed. Messalina never appeared with blood on her hands. She used omens, customs, loyalty oaths. She operated through whispers in corridors and veiled concerns from palace aides. And Claudius? He remained unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see. After all, the empire appeared stable. The Senate kept functioning. The provinces sent taxes. The people cheered. And yet beneath that calm Roman marble, the walls were rotting. Messalina had become the quiet ruler of Rome, not through armies or edicts, but through shame, seduction, and silence. The empress was no longer just a scandal. She was a system, a shadow government that fed on secrets and bled out anyone who stood in its way. And it was only growing stronger. The system spreads. Rome is an empire of influence. When the capital sneezes, the provinces catch a fever. What happens in the halls of the Palatine doesn't stay there. It becomes precedent, tradition, a model to be imitated. And that's exactly what Messalina's machinery became, a template for power. Her palace operation, so meticulously constructed and cloaked in imperial dignity, began to ripple outward across the Mediterranean world. Governors in Gaul, Hispania, and the eastern provinces saw what Messalina had done, not just the exploitation, but the efficiency of it. And they took notes. Inscriptions from North Africa mention hospitality arrangements for visiting dignitaries, arrangements that curiously resemble the Roman capital's system. In Syria, excavated records describe lists of preferred companions drawn from noble families. The language mimics the language used in Rome's court: honor through service, loyalty through sacrifice. What Messalina had created wasn't just a palace brothel. It was a policy. It seeped into the empire's bones, not as scandal, but as standard. Entire wings of provincial government buildings were subtly renovated. Small rooms with thick walls and no windows, quietly added onto estates and offices. Entertainment halls, some were labeled. But their purpose? Chillingly familiar. Imagine being a noblewoman in Alexandria, or Carthage, or Antioch. You've never seen Rome, but Rome's grip has reached you just the same. You receive a summons, not from the empress, but from a local governor now imitating her style. The same honor-bound language, the same threats, veiled in patriotism. And you know, to refuse is to risk everything your family has built. Messalina's system wasn't copied because it was wicked. It was copied because it worked. Political opponents neutralized. Foreign alliances secured through veiled gifts. Revenue generated from the shame of the elite. And through it all, plausible deniability. No soldiers storming homes, no riots in the streets. Just a quiet, creeping rot beneath Rome's civilized surface. There's even evidence that temples, yes, temples, were used as front operations. Priestesses, noblewomen, even vestals in the provinces were allegedly redirected into administrative service when found unsuitable for spiritual duties. service that often led them into the very networks modeled on Messalina's blueprint. And still, the system expanded. Why? Because it provided something every official craved: control. Control over rivals, control over resources, control over women whose very existence once threatened the ambitions of powerful men. Messalina didn't just exploit women. She rewrote their place in the imperial order. No longer symbols of virtue or dynastic pride, noblewomen became tools. Political levers, human bribes, and families, despite the suffering, began to accept it. Some even volunteered their daughters, knowing the system rewarded compliance. A governor's favor here, a Senate vote there, a marriage alliance saved from disgrace. This was the final stroke of Messalina's genius: normalization. The system didn't rely on fear alone. It relied on incentive, on ambition, on the quiet, burning desire of every Roman to rise, even if it meant stepping over their daughters to do it. And the scariest part? It worked so seamlessly that no rebellion ever formed. No protest rose from the forum. No poet dared satirize it in the theater. Because when exploitation wears the mask of honor, who dares to call it evil? Messalina had turned sexual dominance into imperial infrastructure, and the world copied her. But even she didn't foresee what would happen when the system she built, so perfectly tuned to fear and secrecy, was suddenly dragged into the light. And that light came from her own hand. The final fall. It began with music. Not whispers, not steel, not blood, but music. Flutes, lyres, garlands strung across marble columns. Guests laughing under torches as servants poured wine. A wedding. In the gardens of Lucullus, the very gardens Messalina had stolen through deceit and death, she hosted a ceremony unlike any in imperial memory. The bride was Messalina, the groom, Gaius Silius, a handsome, ambitious nobleman. Her lover, young, popular, and foolish enough to believe that marrying the emperor's wife, while the emperor was still alive, was a good idea. And it wasn't done in secret. This was a public, official Roman wedding. Witnesses, contracts, vows before gods. It was madness and treason. Claudius, the emperor, was away in Ostia inspecting harbor projects, oblivious. But news traveled fast in Rome, and the wedding wasn't whispered behind doors. It was celebrated with pomp and pride. That night, Rome's elites watched the empire's most dangerous woman crown herself mistress of a second husband, openly, brazenly, as if the laws of gods and men no longer applied to her. And perhaps, in her mind, they didn't. For 7 years, she had outwitted rivals, bled enemies dry, and ruled from the shadows. Who could stop her now? Who would dare? But in that moment of arrogance, Messalina did the one thing her system couldn't survive. She made it visible. The palace blackmail, the forced prostitution, the political murders, they were all hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability, myth, and bureaucracy. But a second marriage? A wedding while her husband wore the crown? That was public. That was treason. And for once, Rome responded. When Claudius received word, the confusion was so total he thought it must be a prank. A bad dream. His aides had to show him official records from the ceremony before he believed it. Even then, he hesitated. It wasn't until Narcissus, his secretary, long suspicious of Messalina, gathered the evidence and forced his hand that Claudius acted. He gave the order. Execute her. End it. No trial, no plea, just silence. Imperial guards found Messalina in the very garden she'd once taken in blood. There, amid the hedges and statues, she pleaded, not like an empress, not like a woman who had ruled Rome's darkest empire, but like a frightened girl. She begged for mercy, offered explanations, tried to write a letter to Claudius, asking forgiveness. But the guards had their orders. When she hesitated to die by her own hand, hesitated to plunge the blade into her chest, a soldier stepped forward and did it for her. And just like that, the shadow fell. Messalina's body was buried in silence. Her name was stricken from records, statues destroyed, letters burned. Rome tried to erase her memory as if the nightmare could be undone with chisels and ink. But shadows don't die with the body. And though the woman was gone, the system she created had already taken root far beyond the walls of Rome. In that final moment, one can only wonder, did she realize the enormity of what she had done? Not just the betrayals or murders, but the transformation of Rome itself? Or was she simply afraid of death, of silence, of being forgotten? Because for all her cruelty, Messalina feared one thing above all else: irrelevance. But she would never be irrelevant again. Her name would survive not in triumph, but in terror. Not as a ruler, but as a warning. Shadows that remain. Messalina is dead. Her empire collapsed. Her name struck from public inscriptions. The Senate passed damnatio memoriae, the official erasure of a person from Roman history. It was meant to wipe her from the record. But history doesn't forget. It festers. Because while the woman perished in the gardens of Lucullus, the system she built did not die with her. It had already wormed its way into the bones of empire, into the corridors of governors' halls, into the language of politics, into the expectations of Rome's elite. The practice of leveraging shame, of turning the human body into currency, of rewriting violence as loyalty, that continued. Quietly, unquestioned, passed down like ritual. We know this because of what survived. Roman record keepers, obsessive and meticulous, archived everything: schedules, revenue logs, names of clients, medical records, even handwritten notes from administrators requesting replacements. Some of these fragments endured for centuries in private collections, monastic libraries, and Vatican archives. They were hidden, but not destroyed. Archaeological excavations on the Palatine Hill have uncovered structural evidence. Hidden rooms, reinforced doors, signs of use inconsistent with ceremonial function. These weren't guest quarters, they were workspaces, for something Rome never admitted in public. We even have letters, encoded, ambiguous, between local governors and palace officials, referencing services rendered and favors exchanged, all following a pattern laid down during Messalina's reign. It's estimated that hundreds of Roman noble families were touched by this system. Thousands lived in fear, and many of those whose lives were shattered never spoke again. Their stories didn't make the histories, because shame is silence's oldest ally. And that's where Messalina's legacy becomes something more terrifying than villainy. Because she didn't just do these things, she made them seem normal, justified, inevitable. She manipulated the language of honor to mask humiliation. She wrapped abuse in protocol. She taught a generation of Romans that sacrifice of self was the price of loyalty, that the body was state property, that love, marriage, family, all could be suspended for imperial service. And Rome applauded. This isn't just a story about ancient brutality. It's a case study in systemic manipulation, how power, when unchecked, rewrites ethics, how people can come to believe that exploitation is noble, if it's dressed in the right words. Even today, the psychological patterns she exploited are recognizable. The power of shame to silence victims, the way institutions protect abusers through tradition, the complicity of bystanders when incentives outweigh morality, the generational trauma passed down from one act of violence to a lifetime of consequences. Messalina wasn't the first to build such a system, and she certainly wasn't the last. That's why this story matters, because for every woman who served in that palace, for every family line quietly ruined, for every child who grew up under the shadow of their mother's coerced silence, there is a truth that still demands to be spoken. Their names may be lost, but their pain was real, and they deserve more than silence. So we tell their story, not just to remember Messalina's crimes, but to recognize the machinery behind them. Because once you see it, you start to see it everywhere. Messalina is gone, but the systems she built, The manipulation, the silence, the weaponization of shame echoes through time. Not just in Roman marble, but in every institution where power wears a mask. The past doesn't stay buried. It waits. And when we dare to dig, we don't just find history. We find ourselves.